The view from New York City's financial district couldn't be more disparate than some of America's most impoverished communities. Our next guest has actually seen both views. After 18 years, Chris Arnade left his job as a trader on Wall Street to pursue writing and photojournalism. His journey started in the Bronx, where he photographed and spoke to people whose lives were often teetering right on the edge of poverty. Before Donald Trump became president, Chris drove across America, where he found similar stories across lines of race, religion, and geography. Joining me now to talk about his book and the lessons he learned in chronicling this American story is Chris Arnade himself. He's the author of Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Chris, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to drive across the country. And for our audience, Chris is a must-follow on Twitter. He traveled across the country, really chronicling the tale of what the rest of America looks like outside of the cosmopolitan cities. What inspired you to go along that journey, and what are the most important lessons that you learned?
Initially, I was inspired to go to the Bronx in 2013, primarily driven by the financial crisis, and I decided that I was a banker, and I had felt like we, the elites, the banking class, the lawyers, politicians, had, in general, kind of messed up, screwed up, to be honest. And I wanted to rethink the way I thought things and rethink the way I learned things. And instead of just looking at blips on a screen, I actually wanted to talk to people. And so what I found in the Bronx, the South Bronx, a neighborhood that's been long stigmatized, was a frustration in both a frustration and a dignity that I felt was missing from the dialogue. And so what I learned there, I wanted to see if it was true across the rest of the country. So I actually went out before Trump was elected, starting around 2015, and put about 150,000 miles on my car, driving to similar neighborhoods like the South Bronx, neighborhoods that have been long stigmatized by the media, by everybody, actually, where I found something very similar. I found a lot of frustration, a lot of resignation, a lot of anger, but also I found a lot of dignity, a lot of people doing their best to make the best of a bad situation.
And I think, Chris, and that is the title of the book, which is Dignity. And I think one of the most important points that you make there is that there is a sneering and a kind of technocratic view that comes from many of the cities to say, oh, well, if only they would just learn to code, for example, or if only these people would just lift themselves up, when really it's the policies that have been pushed here in Washington for decades, which have led to much of the hollowing out of most of this country and of economic opportunity. Now that President Trump has been in office for 2.5 years, what do you think the feeling is like out there in the rest of the country that propelled many of these people to take a chance and to vote for him?
I've spent the last year and a half since his election, primarily in what I would call the Democratic base, Hispanic communities, working class African American communities, which is also where I spent most of my journey as well. And I think while there's an appreciation for the economic success that's going on right now, I think in general, one of the biggest things I think I try to get across is there's a big difference in the way we talk about politics, me, you, New York Times, Washington Post, political reporters, and the way that most people think about politics. I don't want to say apathy, because that's unfair, but they just don't pay that much attention to politics right now. And I liken it to the NFL, where this show and other shows on Sunday morning that I've gone on are kind of like inside the NFL Sunday morning shows. And Twitter is kind of like the parking lot of a Jets-Bills game, on Sunday morning. The reality for most of the country is more like, hey, every year you tune in and you watch the Super Bowl for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. You might pay a little attention that week, but people really don't. What we focus on, and if I'm out there in the country, like I spent 6 weeks in the McDonald's in El Paso, right near the border, in January, when there was so much talk on Twitter about the government shutdown, immigration issues, and I didn't hear any of that. And this was a primarily Mexican American crowd that literally crosses the border often every day, and the frustrations voiced by people were more like, "Hey, man, local traffic is really bad," or I didn't get my disability checked. So people don't really talk about politics the way I think we in the press talk about politics. You know,
Yeah.
it's much more kind of broad themes, and in that sense, I don't think they've really focused on 2020 yet.
That's an excellent point. You're absolutely right, which is, they focus on traffic, the things that affect their lives, the disability checks, government shutdowns and all of that don't really matter until they possibly have an implication directly within their lives. So what is it, the major themes that we should be focusing on? What are the themes that make people feel that apathy towards politics?
It's very much about, first of all, don't talk down to people. I mean, don't tell them what's best for them. Don't tell them they're rubes. Don't tell them they're they're badly informed. Just people don't like to be talked down to. How hard is that to understand? I like to say that politicians go into these cities and say, your job is obsolete, your lifestyle is icky. Now move. Oh, and vote for me. I mean, what the frustrations in these places are very, very focused. One of the universal frustration is healthcare. The one issue I hear about all the time is healthcare. People want that solved. I happen to be on the left. I believe in universal healthcare. Something has to happen with healthcare, because the reality is that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where people hey, that's where people start thinking about politics. The other one is, by and large, they want a job, they want healthcare, and they want to be left alone. And the other one is traffic. Everybody talks about traffic.
Right. So, Chris, you have such a deep understanding then of the Democratic base. What do you make of the 2020 field on the Democratic side so far? You have Joe Biden kind of embracing a politics of yesterday, a consensus-driven, China is not a threat, America is still on the rise. You have a Bernie Sanders and an Elizabeth Warren who are pushing big policy interventions, a reordering of the American economy, speaking to much of the frustration of what you're talking about. How do you think things are shaking out within the primary field right now?
I'll be upfront. I mean, I support Elizabeth Warren, so I don't want to cloud come out and say something. But
sure.
Having said that, I feel like Biden has a lot more appeal than I think Twitter recognizes, and I think the polls show that.
Yes.
Again, it's aspirational. I think a lot of people misunderstand what they misunderstand about Trump. They said, my view on Trump was very much he came in and he was basically saying, I'm going to knock over the checkerboard. This isn't working for you. I'm going to knock over the checkerboard. I think in many ways, Obama was also that person. People forget that. People voted for taking a chance on him. In that sense, I think someone like Mayor Pete and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have a chance. There are people the electorate wants to take a chance on. However, I think Biden is well known. He's just, especially in minority communities and Hispanic communities, the places I spent a lot of the last year and a half, he's a familiar face. He is in many ways the extension of Obama. And I think for a lot of people, that's very appealing. So I think, Twitter is missing the strength of Biden, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if you have an outsider come in and upend the system, because I think people at some level really do want to change. Now, the change has to be aspirational, and that's where I worry about. In many ways, I worry about my candidate, Warren. I think people need simple messages that are aspirational, and I think Sanders does a better job of that at a tactical level than Warren does, even though I believe Warren is a better candidate.
That's an interesting point that you make there. I mean, she's come out as the woman with a plan. She has a plan for everything: the economic patriotism, for college tuition, for all of these different things. But on a tactical basis, you're saying that it's almost the simpler, more aspirational message, and obviously, the intellectual consistency of Bernie Sanders that might make him more appealing to the people who are predisposed to want to vote for a candidate like that.
That's right. I mean, again, Trump's message wasn't aspirational, but it certainly was simple. And what he got right was he understood that people just want to be acknowledged. So many candidates had yet to acknowledge, the general consensus was, one of the things that struck me out of, all my time was I was very much pro-NAFTA. I was very much free trade before this whole process started. And then I went into towns, and everybody, town after town, people would just point to me to an empty field and said, "That's where my factory used to be. It moved. What are you going to do about that?" And my tendency was to want to say, "Well, actually, that's better for you in the long run." But I stopped. I just stopped, and I said, that they've been hearing that by everybody all the time. This is good. This is good for the country. We need to move to a post-industrial economy. We need to move to a service industry. At some point, you just got to stop and say, "I hear you." And in that sense, Trump did that. Even though I don't support him at all, I acknowledge that that's what he did. He went in and he acknowledged people's issues. And I think Sanders does that, and Warren's doing that as well.
So, Chris, it's like I said, it's been 2 years of the Trump presidency. Ultimately, he needs to rely on to be able to speak to many of those people again. But on the Democratic side, it seems that there's been a doubling down on the politics of impeachment, on the politics of Washington, which, like you said, just make no difference in the lives of many people. Or if they do, they don't seem to recognize it at this moment. Do you think that the Democratic Party is in the right place to speak to the concerns of the people that you write about in this book?
As a Democrat, I would like to say yes, but I would acknowledge that my concern is, it's inside baseball or inside football stuff. The sports analogy has a lot of weight, but what I keep on saying is the difference between an election and a sport is that in an election, the fans decide who wins. So you can do all the analysis on what's going on in Washington, D.C. You can do all the analysis of the different lineups in baseball. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the score is on the field. It matters what the fans, who the fans clap the loudest for.
Right.
And, in terms of the impeachment issue, I don't have a good pulse on that. I haven't been following D.C., to be honest. I will just say that I rarely hear about Russia or impeachment when I'm actually out talking to voters. What I hear about is healthcare. I hear about healthcare, and I hear about traffic issues.
Right. So final question for you, Chris. One of the things that I admired most about your work is how it really told the story of what was happening in 2016 versus what the media was telling us in 2016. So do you think that the media has done a better job of recognizing and speaking to the issues that affect the people that you write about?
I share a lot of the frustrations that Twitter shares with these people who are going out in the country to talk to voters, where what they do is they make it, perfect example is Youngstown, Ohio. When I went to Youngstown, Ohio, which is 50% black, I wrote about it being 50% black. I interviewed a lot of African Americans. I talked to Muslims at a mosque in Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown, Ohio, like a lot of America, a lot of red America, is very diverse. And I feel like these pieces go out and do it. They just simply look at the white working class and say, here's another frustrated voter. I think these pieces are well-intentioned. I think they're trying to address a deficit, but they're in many cases they're shooting themselves in the foot by doing these cartoonish pieces.
I couldn't agree with you more, Chris, and I really appreciate you joining me. So again, the book is Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America by Chris Arnade. Really excellent book, and he's an excellent follow on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we'll have more Rising coming up after this.